The Centrality of Deconstruction, Killing the Buddha and Freeing Ourselves from Limiting Assumptions. My name is Dr. Stephen Bacon. I'm a clinical psychologist in Santa Barbara, California, and I've spent the past decade writing books and researching exactly how psychotherapy works. Kill the Buddha. Constructionism is not a recent invention. In fact, some of the best and earliest constructionist thought comes from Eastern traditions. In the following story, the Zen teacher recommends certain practices and perspectives if one wishes to approach enlightenment. When asked why he practiced Zen, the student said, "Because I intend to become a Buddha." His teacher picked up a brick and started polishing it. The student asked, "What are you doing?" The teacher replied, "I'm trying to make a mirror." "How can you make a mirror by polishing a brick?" "How can you become Buddha by doing Zazen? If you understand sitting Zen, you will know that Zen is not about sitting or lying down. If you want to learn sitting Buddha, know that sitting Buddha is without any fixed form. If you practice sitting as Buddha, you must kill Buddha. If you are attached to the sitting form, you are not yet mastering the essential principle." The student heard this admonition and felt as if he had tasted sweet nectar. Kill the Buddha and the research. What's truly remarkable is that a story created hundreds of years before the invention of psychotherapy would exactly predict the chief finding of the outcome studies. Techniques have no inherent power. Note that the teacher is adamant about taking this lesson seriously. He believes that without grasping it, it is impossible to become enlightened. The modern corollary in psychotherapy is that a belief in the inherent power of techniques will limit the therapist's average results. This is not a metaphor. Any therapist who is attached to the concept of techniques will have limited outcomes. The need for a deconstruction practice. The previous video has described the freedom available to the constructionist therapist in comparison to the standard therapist. But this freedom rests on the ability to effortlessly and effectively deconstruct the extant assumptions of the medical model. Simply asserting that psychotherapeutic thought and practice are constructed fails to lead to the desired level of freedom. To walk through that door, a kind of death is necessary. More specifically, psychotherapists need to deconstruct almost all standard paradigms, including evidence-based interventions, best practices, diagnostic categories, good and bad prognoses, client characteristics, skills, techniques, addictions, trauma, and ego. The utility of cringing. A constructionist therapist needs to cringe inwardly when they hear about the 5 love languages, or parent skills training, or the DBT as the treatment for borderlines. One needs to cringe not because these approaches are ineffective. Remember that the research clearly documents that every credible approach works, but because they each have a way to influence one or even bewitch one into seeing the medical model as real and not as constructed. Moreover, understanding why there can't possibly be 5 love languages, or why the skills taught to parents don't make them more effective, or why the DBT model isn't the best way to treat borderlines, are major contributions to enhancing a personal understanding of fluidity. Let's begin with the 5 love languages. Are there really 5? Or actually, are there 13 or 9? It's obviously determined by the writer, not by reality. And who can say that each person prefers only one? It's probably more accurate that they prefer different ones in different moods, or different ones with different people. All the book is actually saying is, you ought to learn what pleases your lover and respond accordingly. Of course, reading the book helps many people. It can motivate people to pay attention to their own and others' needs, and creates a sense of being conscious about underlying human processes. Anything that enhances this kind of attention is positive, but understanding the limitations of the 5 love languages is vital. It's just another enjoinder to wake up, try harder, and be a better person. Parent skills training. Parent skills training is quite effective, but not because of the skills one learns. The culture already teaches members the basics of parenting. Love your children, model good values, set healthy limits, listen to children, and see them as unique individuals, etc. Parent skills training involves elaborations on these basic, already known concepts. The improvement arises because of the group process. Participants are motivated to use the skills they already know because they have committed to the group and to improving as parents. They know they will be sharing at the next group meeting, and they want the approval of the group. Of course, certain participants literally learn some new skills. They express gratitude and attribute progress in parenting to these new skills. But one can analyze these responses using some imaginary exercises. For the first exercise, imagine that at the first session of the parenting skills class, you decide to recreate the parenting skills curriculum with a whiteboard exercise. Take 45 minutes and via a series of questions about good parenting, draw out everything your group already knows about boundaries, reinforcements, limits, unconditional love, etc. At the end of the 45 minutes, you would realize that your whiteboard record of the conversation includes the complete curriculum of every manual you've ever read about parenting skills. More skills training imaginations. Take a group of people who score very high on parenting skills, that is, therapists. Now imagine comparing the outcomes of their children to other children in the same social class. If the skills are important, the therapist children should clearly outshine the rest. Of course, we know they won't. Similarly, are all therapist marriages better because the therapist is excellent at communication skills? Are all therapist divorces better because therapists know conflict resolution skills? The truth is that many people think that the main difference between therapist families and non-therapist families is that therapists tend to be more neurotic and hence get worse outcomes. If the skills were actually innately powerful, everyone would want to be a therapist, since therapists allegedly know secret, powerful, healing life skills that guarantee that they and their families will have better lives. All skills trainings are misrepresented from a constructionist perspective. These critiques are not simply for parent skills training. The whiteboard exercise can recreate the curriculums for anger management groups, assertiveness training, coping skills training, divorce recovery groups, and so on. Of course, certain members in every group won't know every skill, but they almost certainly know an alternative skill that they can use if they are motivated. Every member of an anger management group, when motivated, knows 4 or 5 skills to control their anger. Teaching them 8 or 10 doesn't make the difference. It's motivating them to use what they already know. When the constructionist kills the idea of the power of techniques, they can put all their concentration on what really matters. How to use the group to motivate the person. How to use their own influence to motivate the person. What is blocking the client from using what they already know? These are the kinds of factors that make a difference, but one needs to evolve beyond techniques to fully focus on what is truly important. Deconstructing the self. It's important not to simply deconstruct books and systems. A constructionist therapist needs to deconstruct basic concepts like self, emotions, and mind if they wish to understand and work with the fluidity inherent in the psychotherapeutic milieu. For example, take this quote from a noted family therapist that critiques an easy acceptance of the concept of the self. A distinction between therapeutic approaches may be helpful to illustrate the way language is understood. A humanist or psychodynamic approach utilizes a concept of self which suggests there is a coherent and bounded sense of a me that will act in a consistent way across many contexts because the me is influenced by a core inner self. Many systemic therapists take a different view. They would say we are constantly recreating our sense of self through interaction with others and with language. And the sense we all have of a coherent me is actually due to the fact that we interact repeatedly with familiar people and linguistic concepts. Most of us already know that the self can be framed variously from the traditional, illustrated in the quote, to the relational. The self doesn't exist inside a person. It exists in the space between two people. to the no-self concept of the Buddhist psychologists. The constructionist therapist is less interested in what is true and more interested in what is helpful or useful for the specific client in front of them. Deconstructing symptoms. The most challenging part of deconstruction are client symptoms. We know that suffering is real, but we also know that the form of that suffering, the specific symptom, is constructed. This means that spirit possession culture members exhibit symptoms aligned with spirit possession, and Western cultural members exhibit symptoms aligned with neuroses and traumas. Take PTSD as an example. The near-death unusual situation criteria for PTSD suggests that people in virtually every culture will have some symptoms after such experiences. The variability in symptoms, however, suggests that they are more fluid and adaptable than normally thought. The medical metaphor suggests that these symptoms come from the inside, from a real disease, and imply that they will be similar across cultures, just like diabetic symptoms will be the same across cultures. The fact that the symptoms vary so widely gives the constructionist therapist the opening to imagine that the client could still have had a real PTSD experience, but his symptoms can be fluid. That is, they might be able to improve quickly or change to new symptoms that are less debilitating. One of the nice contributions of EMDR and hypnosis, mostly because they heal via altered states, is that those practitioners are open to rapid change and improvement, even with severe PTSD. Constructionists who have deconstructed specific symptoms while still honoring human suffering are open to similar types of improvement. Deconstructing constructionist psychotherapies. Recall that the Zen teacher was instructing students who were already constructionists. Similarly, there are a number of extant systems of constructionist psychotherapy that require deconstruction. The most serious problem in this area is that these constructionist systems all promote interventions as if they are techniques. Apparently, they are unfamiliar with the research that demonstrates that they are all rituals. As such, their outcomes become limited to the typical outcomes already achieved by standard psychotherapies. For example, narrative therapy recommends an externalization technique where the clients are taught to create a relationship with their symptoms as if they were a personalized entity. For example, Mr. Anxiety or Sneaky Poo. Clients using this externalization technique often experience a reduction in shame and guilt as they locate the nexus for the symptoms outside of themselves. This reduction is net positive and contributes to good outcomes. The problem is that almost all psychological systems have ways of reducing anxiety. For example, psychodynamic psychotherapy comforts an inner child, and CBT helps the client identify with the rational mind as it disputes irrationalities. In sum, the intervention used by narrative therapy is helpful, but not more helpful than what currently exists. As a result, it fails to contribute to enhancing outcomes. More problematically, the narrative therapist can become fixed on the powerful technique and use it too often and inappropriately. In other words, every time a therapist believes in a technique, their chance of maximizing outcomes is reduced. Put another way, they are no longer constructionists. They have reified externalization into a therapeutic principle and have lost their fluidity and their full ability to respond to client fit. Rejection of hierarchical relationships. The most serious technique recommended by most extant constructionist psychotherapies, especially narrative and collaborative psychotherapy, is the insistence that the therapeutic relationship be non-hierarchical. Narrative therapy recommends making statements into questions to decrease hierarchy, and collaborative therapy insists that the only expertise possessed by a therapist, in comparison to the client, is the ability to create an open, accepting, and curious space. While some clients clearly benefit from a non-hierarchical relationship, others presumably change more quickly in a hierarchical one. This insistence on no hierarchy violates the principles of client fit and limits the fluidity of these therapists. It turns the therapeutic relationship into a rigid technique, just as rigid as the old psychoanalytic insistence on acting like a blank screen to encourage projection and transference. Once again, everything works sometimes, but emphasizing fluidity and client fit is the actual essence of constructionism. Anything that limits those factors limits freedom and outcomes. The Sufis meet Kill the Buddha. When Yasavi started to teach, he was soon surrounded by potential disciples and people of all descriptions. They all listened to what he had to say, but they insisted more and more loudly on him enrolling them in a regular teaching curriculum. Yasavi told them that he wanted them to build a special structure, a tekya, in which people could carry out exercises similar to those which were found throughout Turkestan. Several hundred people worked under his direction for 6 months, making this edifice. When it was complete, Yasavi said, "All who want to enter this building for instruction, please stand to the right, over there, and those who do not want to do so, stand over there, to the left." When they were arranged in the two groups, Yasavi said, "I dismiss all those who stand to the right. There is nothing I can do for you. Therefore return whence you came. The remainder may become my students. Their first task is to demolish the tekya." The dismissed students became disaffected and spread tales to the effect that Yasavi was insane. But it is from the selectivity of this madman of God that the teaching of the masters is derived. Debriefing Yasavi. First, no one should be surprised that there are Kill the Buddha stories in all spiritual traditions. Given that constructionism takes form in every culture, advanced reflective thought will always offer some examples of it. Yasavi tells us that we are only teachable if we understand that the price of admission is to demolish the tekya. The universe of students is divided between those who wish to learn but are covertly committed to supporting the extant order, and those who understand that learning requires rejecting the extant order. Constructionism is widespread, both in psychotherapy and in Western culture in general. However, it only becomes useful when it is combined with demolishing the tekya, killing the Buddha. This is not just an aesthetic or intellectual point. The ability to employ constructionist principles effectively depends on a visceral stance which disputes the literal credibility of the given worldview, the standard way of seeing things. Deconstructing the medical model. The primary metaphor of the medical model is that human suffering is like having a disease. While it is important for every therapist to understand this metaphor, since it is the metaphor that dominates in Western culture, the primary goal of a constructionist therapist is to move inside and outside the metaphor gracefully and easily. Understanding that this model is not simply a metaphor, but a metaphor that is usually unhelpful is the first step. Killing the power of this metaphor is necessary if one wishes to harvest the benefits of constructionism. Only after a profound sense of freeing oneself from shared beliefs does one have an opportunity to move forward. Rumi tells us, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about."